To the rest of the world, we were the Callaway boys, sons of the most respected land developer in Harlan County, Kentucky. My father's name was on the side of 2 office buildings and a wing of the regional hospital. People stopped him in grocery store parking lots just to shake his hand. I used to think that meant something. I was 22 the night he told me I was no longer welcome in his house. It wasn't a conversation. It wasn't even a fight. Not really. My younger brother Derek and I had just come back from visiting our grandfather, our mother's father, Raymond Moss, at his property about 40 minutes outside of town. Dad had never liked Raymond, never said why, just called him that old man and changed the subject whenever his name came up. That night we walked through the front door, still smelling like Raymond's wood smoke and pine sap, and our father was sitting at the kitchen table waiting for us like a judge behind a bench. He told us we had to choose, him or Raymond. Derek looked at me. I looked at Dad. And I said the wrong thing, apparently, because 10 minutes later we were standing in the driveway with 2 duffel bags between us and the porch light clicking off behind our backs. I want to be clear about something. Raymond Moss was not a wealthy man. He didn't have a hospital wing or an office building. What he had was 43 acres of land in the hills outside Harlan, a farmhouse that needed a new roof, and a workshop nobody had been inside since my grandmother passed 7 years before. He was the kind of man who fixed things twice before he ever considered replacing them. He kept his word. He remembered your birthday, not because he wrote it down, but because he actually cared. When we showed up at his door that night, with our bags, he didn't ask questions. He just moved his coat off the extra chair and put the kettle on. Raymond let us stay. Derek took the back bedroom. I slept on the fold-out couch in the living room, and for about 6 weeks that winter, we worked odd jobs, helped Raymond with firewood and fence repair, and tried to figure out what came next. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't easy, but it felt more honest than anything I'd lived in the previous 22 years. Then Raymond had his stroke. It was a Tuesday morning in February. He was in the kitchen making eggs when it happened. Derek found him on the floor and called 911. The paramedics got there fast enough, but the damage was already done. Raymond spent 3 weeks in the ICU at Harlan ARH and never came home. He died on a Thursday afternoon while Derek and I were sitting on either side of his bed, holding his hands, watching the monitor slow down like a metronome running out of spring. He was the only adult in our lives who had ever looked at us like we were worth something. I didn't know how to carry that loss, and I still don't, not completely. What he left us was the property. All 43 acres, the farmhouse, the truck, and something else. Something we didn't fully understand until a few days after the funeral when his attorney, a quiet woman named Miss Patricia Hale, called us in to go over the paperwork. The will was simple. Everything to Derek and me, split equally. Miss Hale walked us through the land deed, the account balance, which was modest, a little under $11,000, and then she slid a sealed envelope across the desk. Raymond's handwriting was on the front, just our names, Owen and Derek. Inside was a single handwritten page and a small brass key. The letter said this: "Boys, the workshop has been locked since your grandmother died. I wasn't ready to open it before now. Everything inside is yours. Use it carefully. The key goes to the padlock on the north wall cabinet, not the door. The door hasn't been locked in years. I love you both more than I ever said out loud, and I'm sorry I didn't say it more. Raymond." I read it 3 times sitting in that office chair. Derek read it twice and then folded it back up very slowly, like he was being careful not to damage something that had already survived a long time. We didn't go to the workshop that same day. I don't know why exactly. Maybe we needed time. Maybe we were afraid of what careful actually meant. We went back to the farmhouse, made sandwiches neither of us ate, and sat on the porch until it got dark. The workshop was about 60 feet from the back of the house, a low-slung building with cedar siding that had gone gray over the years. Raymond had built it himself in the late 80s. I'd been inside maybe twice as a kid, mostly to look at his tools. After my grandmother died, he'd put a padlock on the door and never mentioned it again. The next morning, Derek was already up when I came downstairs. He was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee. looking out at the workshop. "You sleep?" he asked. "Not really," I said. He handed me his cup. "Let's go open it." The door swung open without ceremony. No creak, no dramatic pause. Raymond had kept the hinges oiled, apparently, even when he wasn't going inside. The workshop smelled the way I remembered. Sawdust and machine oil and something faintly sweet I could never identify. A wood stove sat cold in the corner. His workbench ran along the south wall, tools hanging above it on pegboard, each one outlined in pencil so you'd know exactly where it belonged. Along the north wall, floor to ceiling, were wooden cabinets Raymond had built himself. Most of them had simple latches. One, near the far end, had a padlock. Derek handed me the key. I won't pretend I wasn't nervous. My hands were steadier than I expected. Actually, steadier than they'd been at the funeral, steadier than they'd been in Dad's driveway that night in December. The padlock opened on the first try. Inside the cabinet were two things. The first was a steel fireproof document box, the kind you can get at any hardware store, gray with a combination lock. The second was a small index card taped to the inside of the cabinet door, written in Raymond's handwriting. "Combination is your grandmother's birthday. Month, then day, then year. My grandmother, Eleanor Moss, was born on March 14, 1941. I knew that because Raymond had mentioned her birthday every single year, without fail, always with the same quiet note in his voice. 03-14-41. The box opened. Inside were documents. A lot of documents, and not the kind I expected. Not just a second will or insurance papers. There were property records, survey maps, correspondence printed on letterhead I recognized. My father's company letterhead. Callaway Land Development, LLC. I picked up the first page and started reading. It took me about 20 minutes to understand what I was looking at. Then I sat down on Raymond's workshop stool and read it again, because I needed to be sure. What Raymond had been collecting quietly for almost 8 years was evidence. Evidence that my father's company had been running a land fraud operation targeting elderly property owners in 3 counties: Harlan, Bell, and Letcher. The scheme worked like this. Representatives from Callaway Land Development would approach older landowners, often widows or widowers, with inflated assessments and purchase offers on their property. The offers looked legitimate on the surface, but buried in the paperwork were clauses that rolled mineral rights and timber rights back to Callaway within 18 months of sale at a fraction of the assessed value. Several of the sellers had signed without fully understanding what they were giving up. A few of them had been represented by the same notary, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who appeared in the documents repeatedly and who, it turned out, had been paid a referral fee for every signature he witnessed. Raymond Moss had sold a parcel of land to my father's company 9 years ago, 12 acres he'd inherited from his own father. He'd thought it was a fair deal at the time. It wasn't until 2 years later, when a neighbor mentioned losing her timber rights, that Raymond started pulling threads. He never hired a lawyer. He just started keeping records, quietly, methodically, the way a man does when he builds something he intends to last. Letters he'd sent and the non-responses he'd received, copies of deeds he'd obtained through public records requests, a hand-drawn map showing which parcels had been acquired and when, with the names of the sellers written in his small, careful print. A folder of newspaper clippings from the Harlan Daily Enterprise dating back 6 years with certain names circled. And at the back of the box, in a sealed plastic sleeve, a USB drive. I looked at Derek. Derek looked at the drive. "We need a laptop," he said. What was on that drive was methodical in a way that made me realize Raymond had been thinking about this for a long time. Scanned copies of every document in the box, organized by date and county. A spreadsheet. Raymond had apparently taught himself basic Excel at some point, tracking every transaction he'd identified, with columns for seller name, sale date, parcel acreage, and a final column labeled notes that contained short, plain-spoken descriptions of what he believed had happened to each person. One entry read, "Dottie Maynard, 74, Letcher Co., sold 22 acres. Believed she was keeping her house. House was on acreage that transferred. She's referencing now from the new owners." Another, "Harold and June Combs, both in their 80s, Belco, signed with Pruitt as notary. Harold has dementia diagnosis from 2017. Signature dated 2019. I stopped reading after about 15 entries. Not because I wanted to stop, but because something was happening in my chest that I needed to wait out before I could see straight. Raymond had known. He'd known what my father's company was doing to people like him, people who'd worked their land their whole lives and trusted the wrong piece of paper. And he hadn't gone to the newspapers or hired an attorney or made a phone call to anyone in a position of power. He'd built a file, he'd organized his evidence, and then he'd locked it in a cabinet and waited until the right moment to pass it on. To us. I thought about the letter again. Use it carefully. I sat with that for a long time. Derek was the one who suggested the FBI. Not a local attorney, not the county sheriff, the FBI, specifically the Financial Crimes Division. He'd been reading on his phone while I was sitting there with my thoughts, and he'd found the federal statute on real estate wire fraud. If the transactions had involved wire transfers across state lines, and the spreadsheet suggested some of them had, this wasn't just a state matter. This was federal. I won't pretend that decision was easy or immediate. I want to be honest about that. Because the man whose name was on that letterhead was still our father. He'd thrown us out of his house and told us to choose, but he was still the man who taught me to drive a stick shift in an empty church parking lot on a Saturday morning when I was 16. You don't just set that down without looking at it first. Derek and I talked for most of that night, sitting in Raymond's kitchen, the wood stove going, the box of documents on the table between us, like a third person in the room. We talked about what Raymond would have wanted. We talked about Dottie Maynard renting her own land from new owners. We talked about Harold and June Combs. By midnight, we'd made our decision. Miss Hale, Raymond's attorney, helped us make contact with the right people. She wasn't a federal attorney herself, but she knew enough to know we needed to be careful about how we walked into this. She helped us put together a summary document, a clean, organized presentation of what Raymond had compiled, and she accompanied us to the FBI field office in Lexington on a Thursday morning in March. The agent who took our case was a woman named Special Agent Danielle Forsyth. She was direct and unhurried, which I appreciated. She looked at the documents without expression, asked us precise questions, and at the end of the meeting told us that what we'd brought in was, in her words, substantive. She said she couldn't tell us what the investigation would look like or how long it would take. She said to be careful about who we discussed this with. We drove back to Harlan in almost complete silence. The next 4 months were the strangest of my life. Derek and I stayed on Raymond's property, started fixing the things that needed fixing. The roof, some fencing along the east pasture, the gutters on the workshop that had been pulling away from the fascia. We applied for jobs. Derek got hired on at a building supply company in town. I picked up work with a small landscaping outfit that needed a second crew member for commercial accounts. We were getting by. Not comfortably, but honestly. The investigation moved quietly. Special Agent Forsyth called us twice with follow-up questions. We answered what we could. We didn't tell anyone else what was happening. Not friends, not the cousins we occasionally saw at the gas station and exchanged nods with. Nobody. My father, meanwhile, remained my father. His name appeared in a ribbon-cutting ceremony in the Harlan Daily Enterprise in June. I saw it while scrolling my phone on a lunch break. A photo of him in a hard hat smiling in front of a new commercial building, local officials on either side of him. I put my phone down and went back to work. Then, in late September, on a Friday morning, my phone rang. It was Miss Hale. She told me the U.S. Attorney's Office had filed charges. Wire fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. Multiple defendants. Gerald Pruitt was among them. 2 company executives I didn't recognize by name were listed as co-conspirators. And my father, Thomas Allen Calloway, named as the primary architect of the scheme. I sat down on the back step of Raymond's farmhouse and looked out at the workshop for a long time. The arraignment was in federal court in Lexington. Derek and I didn't attend, we didn't need to. But we were at the courthouse in a different capacity 3 months later when we were asked to meet with the prosecution team and provide statements about our contact with Raymond and the provenance of the documents. We sat in a conference room on the 4th floor of the federal building and answered every question as completely and accurately as we could. We were there for almost 4 hours. There's a detail I want to include here because I think it matters. When we walked out of that building, Miss Hale told us something I hadn't known until then. Under the Federal Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act, and certain provisions related to reporting original information to federal investigators, we might qualify for a portion of any civil penalties the government recovered in connection with the case. She explained it carefully and told us not to count on anything. I won't say more than that here because the process is ongoing, and I don't want to speak to outcomes that haven't been finalized. But I think Raymond knew. I think that was part of use it carefully, making sure we understood this wasn't just about exposure. It was about restoration, for us and for every name on that spreadsheet. The trial is scheduled for next year. My father has pleaded not guilty. I won't tell you how I feel about that. I think you probably already know. What I will tell you is what happened about 6 weeks after the charges were filed. Derek and I were in the workshop. We'd started using it, slowly, carefully, the way you move into a space you've inherited and are still learning to deserve. Derek was at the workbench repairing a chair leg. I was going through a box of Raymond's older files, organizing, discarding what was past usefulness. In the back of a bottom shelf, I found a photograph I'd never seen. Raymond and my grandmother, Eleanor, young, standing in front of the farmhouse. The house looks newly built, or nearly. The porch railing is freshly painted. The yard has no trees yet, just bare dirt and ambition. Raymond has his arm around her shoulders, and they're both squinting into the sun and grinning like people who don't know what's coming yet and don't need to. On the back, in Raymond's handwriting, first summer, 1968. I showed it to Derek. He looked at it for a moment, then propped it up against the wall above the workbench, where it's been ever since. Derek and I have not changed our last name. We've talked about it, maybe someday. What we have done is paint the farmhouse, deep red, the color Eleanor had apparently wanted for years, but they'd never gotten around to. We found a note about it in her handwriting tucked inside a seed catalog from 1987. We planted a garden in the spring. Neither of us knows much about gardening, but we're figuring it out. The 43 acres are ours. The workshop is ours. The photograph above the workbench is ours. My father's company, Callaway Land Development, is currently under a federal asset freeze pending trial. The name on the side of the hospital wing is still there. I don't know when they'll take it down, or if they will. That's not my decision. What I know is this. Raymond Moss spent years quietly building something he believed we'd need. Not because he knew exactly what would happen, but because he knew us well enough to trust us with it when the time came. He didn't hand us money. He handed us the truth, organized and documented and locked in a cabinet behind a key he knew we'd find. I think about that a lot. The difference between leaving someone resources and leaving someone the means to stand on their own ground. The greatest thing he gave us wasn't 43 acres or a fireproof box full of evidence. It was the understanding that the truth, when you've kept it carefully and long enough, eventually becomes impossible to ignore. No matter how many buildings someone has their name on,